Good morning, everyone. I just want to check to make sure you can see my slide and you can see me.
Hi, Maria. We can see you. We can't see your slide though.
Yes, are not visible.
Dheeraj, are you there? Can you hear me and see me?
Yeah, Maria. We can hear you, see you, and we can see the slides too.
Slides are visible.
I'm not getting confirmation. Hang on one second. Let's try that again. Can someone confirm?
Yes, the slides are visible now.
Excellent. And can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, for some reason I can't. Okay, here we are. All right. It's 10:01 and I'm thinking maybe we wait a few minutes before we start our animal behavior session of the Inclusive Ecology Workshop. And so I'll give it a minute or so. For those of you who are here, welcome and good morning. If you don't already have a notebook or a piece of paper and a pen, go get something and come back because we're going to draw some graphs today and we're going to do some calculations. And I want you to have everything you need for this class to go well. Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Maria Thakur, and I'm your third, maybe fourth faculty who is talking to you in this Inclusive Ecology Workshop of 2023. And this morning, we're going to focus on animal behavior. And so we're going to spend the next 3 hours thinking about animal behavior from the classic sense to how ecologists study it today. And we're going to span a range of topics and a range of approaches. We are a small class today, which is nice. What this means is that you should and must interrupt me along the way. So if I'm going too fast, you raise your hand or put a comment in the chat box and ask me to slow down. If you have any questions about anything I've said, or if you're thinking of questions related to what I just discussed, then you should consider this a class. So you should interrupt me and you should raise your hand or put your comments in the chat. For those of you on YouTube, I can't see your hands raised, of course, but we are keeping an eye on the chat in YouTube. So if you've got questions, please put it there, and either Dheeraj or Akshay will let me know when those questions are there, and they will post it here, and I will address them as they come. All right. So let's talk about animal behavior, both the concepts and the approaches. So I want to start with a quote from one of the most seminal animal behaviors textbooks. So it's a behavioral ecology textbooks written by Krebs and Davies. And they start their textbook saying that animal behavior is a beguilingly simple subject. And what they mean is that all of us can see and observe animal behavior. We can describe it, we can write it down in detail, and it seems like such a simple thing to study. But actually, when we start thinking about it as ecologists and as scientists, there's a great deal of questions we can ask and a great deal of predictions we can try and make when we think about animal behavior the way we think about other traits. So although it's simple in the sense that everybody on earth who watches an animal can describe what they saw, it's still a science. And there's still so much we can do with the study of animal behavior as scientists. So for example, if we look at something like this, right? This is a leaf cutter ant, and clearly carrying a leaf that it cut out from a plant. It's a fantastic behavior. It's this huge object that this ant is carrying. It's cut it so tidily and neatly out of the tree in order to be able to carry it. There are all these questions that we can ask. So as an animal behaviorist or a behavioral ecologist, I could sit outside and observe this behavior and describe it in detail. I can also ask a bunch of questions, which is why this leaf? How big can you get the leaf piece before it becomes too big to carry? Does it matter? Do you need others around you in order to pick a leaf or carry a leaf? How far can you carry it? What are you looking for? There are lots of questions that we could think about just in the observation of something as simple as this. So we can go beyond description to asking why and how and when and how, right? And those sorts of scientific questions related to any behavior on our planet. So here's how we're going to organize today's set. I'm going to divide it into 3 sections. The first is I'm going to talk about the foundations of animal behavior. Basically, how did behaviors come to exist? And then I'm going to talk about a framework that allows us to break down the kinds of questions we want to ask in the study of behavior. And then we'll talk about different approaches. So the first one, we will touch on natural selection as the foundation of animal behavior. And I will briefly describe where learning gets involved. For the second section, we're going to use a framework that Tinbergen put forth. And so the way we ask questions in animal behavior will be Tinbergen's approach. And then finally, we're going to go through an exercise where we ask a question and then try and answer it using optimality as our approach. Well, we can also think about games as a way to answer animal behavioral questions. And towards the end, we can discuss when we use games and when we don't need to use games. Okay. So let's start with a very, very brief history of this field. Now, the study of animal behavior has been around since the beginning of science, and even before science, because people have been watching animals do things for a long time. So natural historians have described animals, how they're feeding in the wild, where they find them, how birds make nests, when they sing. All these descriptions of our natural world and the descriptions of the fantastic behaviors that animals do have been described by natural historians and people for a long time, in poetry, in books, in every form. As a science, we first began systematically describing animal behavior as ethologist. So the word ethology, or the field of ethology, was the description and the systematic description of animal behavior. So people who were observing courtship behavior, for example, were observing the sequence of behaviors in great detail. Right? What do you do? When do you do it? How do you do it? And how long do you do this? What does the courtship sequence look like? Or what does aggression look like? Or what does any of these like sets of behaviors look like? And that was described really systematically through clean observations, right? Where scientists were watching animals and then recording everything they did, and they have replicates. That field evolved to the field of animal behavior, where we started to ask questions of not just what do you do, but what do you do as you're interacting with others? What do you do in relation to your environment? Are you doing the same thing everywhere? Are you doing the same thing at different ages? Are you doing the same thing as a function of how healthy you are, or how old you are, or what sex you are? And so ethology evolved to the field of animal behavior. And so we still do ethology, but now we're asking questions about the context. And then finally, it became the field of behavioral ecology. So you will see both these terms, animal behavior and behavioral ecology, interchangeably. Both of these use ecology as the context. So we're not thinking about animal behaviors in a bubble. We don't think animals behave the same always, but the environment shapes what the right thing is to do at the right time. Right? And so that's where we are right now. So the field right now is between animal behavior and behavioral ecology, both. It also is one of the ecological sciences that we're really proud of, because we have a Nobel Prize associated with animal behavior. And these three gentlemen you see up here, Nicholas Tinbergen, Konrad Lorenz, and Carl von Fritsch, all jointly shared a Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1973 because of their study of animal behavior. So they were observing behaviors by various taxa in systematic ways and asking these interesting questions. Not that just like animal behavior should be described, but why do animals do the things they do? And so how many of you have heard of these three? Can I have a show of hands? Any one of these three? Tinbergen, Lorenz, and Frisch. Great. So may I call on you? So Venu, you put your hand up first. Will you tell us about one of these scientists and what you know?
I believe Konrad Lorenz and his study with the geese, in which parental selection, some kind of behavior was seen in geese, like they had an imprinting on Carl von Frisch as their parent.
Correct. It was a very interesting observation that young birds, and he started with geese, would imprint on the first organism they see and would assume that the first organism they see is their parent. And so he studied these geese, and he had all these geese following him around because he would be the first one they'd see when they hatched. And this was an imprinting behavior that is actually really beneficial for the animal, right? To, in the natural world, when they hatch, to know who's their parent, to be able to imprint right away, allows you to follow the right individual. Great. Someone else? Can someone tell me about fish?
And
What was
Maria,
that? Yes.
Ria in the chat has written Carl fish for bees.
Please, Ria, will you tell us a little bit more? What about his bee research was interesting?
Good morning, ma'am. I read a very brief story about Carl von Frisch about studying bees. He studied the waggle dance and how bees communicate with other individuals about finding food and the directions and, very specified locations they share. So that was it.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, he was the first one to notice that bees communicate in very complex ways, including with the waggle glass. Excellent. Anyone else who knows anything about Tinbergen?
Ma'am, probably Tinbergen gave the four regulative principles that are used as fundamentals for studying any behavior.
Correct. Correct. That was one of his biggest contributions. We will talk about that today in detail. He also studied a range of taxa, including birds. And he actually, amongst the three, spearheaded the kinds of experimental manipulations that we do today as behavioral ecologists. How can we manipulate context or manipulate animals to see how their behaviors change? So anyway, thank you. These three gentlemen won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1973. And since then, we haven't received, as a field, we haven't received another Nobel Prize. So we're rather proud of them for at least bringing everything forward. So let me start with a question and a show of hands. A lot of us think of animal behaviors as instinctual. And that the fact that animals are born or hatch from their eggs and know exactly what to do, right? They know what to eat, like this ant knows what leaf is edible. It knows how to build a nest with the rest of its nest mates. It knows its role in its social system. So how many of you think that most of animal behaviors are instinct? You can see already here that I've got a second question, right? Which is, do animals learn? So let's first do a show of hands. Do we think that most animal behaviors are instinct? No hands. Does that mean that we think animals can learn?
Maria Venu in the chat has said no.
No, I see that. Yeah. No, it's not instinct. I agree. Not everything is instinct. So then if it's not all instinct, then do animals also learn? Can I have a show of hands if people agree with the second? Do animals learn? Is that a yes? Okay.
There are a few comments which are saying yes.
Great. A lot of people are agreeing the animals do learn. Yes, of course they learn. But does that mean that everything they do, they have to learn? Or is there some instinct? So it's a combination of the two, right? You need to have some behaviors that we see today are instinctual, that there's no learning required. It's the animal knows exactly what to do and how to behave. And that is unchanged as they develop. There's a bunch of other behaviors that they have to learn, which does mean that even animals at all taxonomic levels are capable of learning, which means that they're capable of changing their behaviors and adapting to the environment. Because if they couldn't do that, then if the environment changes and their behaviors can't change along with it, then they're stuck, right? So animal behavior actually is a combination of both instinctual behaviors as well as learning related behaviors. And both of these shape what we see today. Now, when we think about animal behavior, we think about how did they come to exist. So for example, this picture here is a chimpanzee that is using a tool, which is remarkable, right? It's got a stick, he's using the stick to put into ant nests, and it gets the ants climb up onto the stick, and then it eats that. How did this happen? How did this behavior come to exist? Tool use. It's rare behavior, right? Not all animals on planet Earth can use tools, but some birds can. Certainly chimpanzees are a fantastic example of tool use. But how did it happen? Can someone provide a potential answer? No? Is it luck?
Ma'am,
Yeah.
I can guess.
Yeah.
Maybe someday it just accidentally happened, and then the animal just learned how, how to go about it, and it just, adapted in its lifestyle, probably.
Great. So I've seen some more comments here. By learning, by accidental, Siddharth says that. Instinct, and then it was successful, and then others learned through observation. So instinct, insight learning. So absolutely. So a little bit of luck that the first individual was stumbling around and stumbled into this ingenious solution. And then it spread through the population through learning. It spread through the population through social learning. One individual figured it out, others observed and learned, and it passed that way. Social learning is what a great deal of our behaviors are shaped by, right? Us as humans, right? We learn from each other. Right? Language is a social learning skill for us as humans, for example. So tool use it spreads through the population through social learning. There's, of course, individual learning. So a bunch of behaviors that we can think about could have evolved or spread in a population through individual learning, which means every generation individuals have to come out and figure out what to eat, what not to eat, right? What tastes bad and what tastes good, or where to hide, for example, right? You can't instinctually know what your habitat is going to have and what is a safe place to hide until you explore it and figure that out, right? And so there's a lot of individual learning that happens. But I want to spend today focusing on natural selection, because even with learning, we still have to have it spread through the population some way. And that way is through natural selection. And so when we think about natural selection, what we really mean is that these traits have an advantage for the animal, and that animal behaviors are adaptations. And so I want us to think about animal behaviors like we think about any other traits. Behavior, all traits, even the ability to learn, has been shaped by natural selection. Of course, there has to be some randomness and luck here, because when we think of a trait spreading in a population, we're thinking about genes, and those mutations for those traits have to come about, right? And mutations are random. And so if those mutations come about for this, so this bird of this paradise flycatcher right here, who is dancing back and forth, is a male who is doing a courtship dance to attract the female. Now it's a complex behavior. He's beautiful. He's got all this very striking color, But the behavior is complex, right? He's got to pull his feathers up, he's got to move side to side, and it's very directed at someone. It's directed at females who are in the environment to try and attract them to him. So we need to think of a gene or a suite of genes that randomly came up in a population. And suppose a gene that came up allowed that individual to raise its feathers versus an individual that didn't. Suddenly he was more obvious. And so then females would want to mate with him because they see him. And so the genes for raising your feathers spread in the population. So a little bit of randomness, some luck that that gene actually allowed you to do something better than the next generation. And then it spreads through natural selection. All of this, of course, is rooted in the origin of species, right? It's rooted in the way Darwin described phenomena. So let's go through natural selection, the steps of natural selection very quickly to make sure that we're all on the same page. So for a behavior to be an adaptation, right? And so let's be clear, what is an adaptation? It gives the animal a benefit, that it's there for a function and it's a beneficial function. So for a behavior to be an adaptation that has evolved under natural selection, we have to think about it like we think about any other traits, right? We have to think about it like we think of morphology, right? What color you are, what shape you are, how long your limbs are, all of this morphology, we think of like a normal trait, right? Like how long your limbs are has been shaped by natural selection because it allows you to walk through your environment very effectively. What color you are, like this cluster of beetles I have a photo here, what color you are could be shaped by your environment, right? That if you're green, then you are more likely to blend into your environment than if you're not. So the evolution of a trait like morphology is the same as the way we would think of behavior. The evolution of the running speed, or the evolution of courtship, or the evolution of aggression. All of that has to apply if we think natural selection has explained what behaviors we see today. So the following conditions must hold. Right? First, there has to be variation in the behavior, right? And that means like the beetles here, where there's variation in color, some colors have to be one way and other colors another way for natural selection to say green is the best. So there has to be variation in behavior. So if we're thinking of that bird that's dancing back and forth, at some point in the evolutionary past of that species, some individuals maybe couldn't raise their feathers, or others did. Or some would have a really short dance and others would have longer dances. So there'd be variation in the kind of behaviors they showed in that context, in the courtship context. This variation must be heritable. So differences in the behaviors must arise from differences in genes. So how long an individual is dancing should have a genetic component to it, right? Or what steps he uses in his dance. Does he go back and forth, or does he go forward, or does he do a zigzag? All of that needs to be inherited in the next generation, which means it has to be encoded in genes for it to persist or be weeded out in the population. So differences in behavior, just like differences in color or body size, must arise from differences in genes. And some behaviors must confer a greater reproductive success than others in the environmental conditions. So again, with these colors, that the small green one is advantageous to the individual in a green habitat, for example. And if that's the case, it can survive and it can produce offspring, and it passes its genes on to the next generation. As opposed to the big yellow one, which is very obvious in a green environment, and so therefore is not likely to survive and is not likely to pass its genes on to the next generation. So with morphology, we see this easily. With behaviors, we should use the same logic, that some behaviors allow the individual to survive and pass its genes on to the next generation better than other behaviors. And so the outcome is the following, that natural selection results in behaviors that are optimal for those ecological conditions. So the green beetle only has an advantage in a green environment, and the yellow beetle has an advantage in a yellow environment. I'm simplifying, of course, but the ecological conditions matter. So we're not just saying green is better always, or dancing back and forth is better always. Dancing back and forth is better in a forested habitat where your colors are visible and you have trees that allow you to dance back and forth, and so you're visible. So the conditions that enable the behavior to have an advantage or disadvantage matters. But this is the same rules that we would have for any trait, right? Morphology, physiology, any evolutionarily shaped trait. So, like all phenotypic traits, behaviors can evolve. Right? And so what natural selection does is it changes the form and frequency of behaviors over generations. Now, I want to make sure that I'm talking about, like that dancing, right? That bird that's dancing, maybe he learned some of that, or maybe the species, every individual of the species just knows how to dance, which means the genes for that kind of dance evolved. This is not to say that learning doesn't evolve, right? Individual learning and social learning can also change in frequency over time. Right? So when we think of the tool use of the chimpanzee, the first time it happened, there was just one individual that did it, right? But then it spread through learning. And so now everyone in that population can use tools to get ants out of nests. So the frequency of tool use has changed over time, even though when the chimps are born, they don't know how to use tools. They have to still learn by observing someone else. So learning, both social and individual learning, also evolves and also changes in the frequency of behaviors over time. But what we want to think about here is natural selection and genes that encode certain behaviors, because actually most behaviors are shaped by natural selection, and only some, given the right kind of context, is shaped by individual learning. I'll pause for a minute. Is everyone following me? Are there any questions at this stage? Yes, Chotika, please tell me.
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yeah.
Usually it's the males who are brightly colored or fit, but doesn't the genes or the qualities of a female irrelevant?
So usually, so let me see if I understand. You said males are usually colorful, and then what about females?
Yeah, the females are selecting the males based on their qualities.
Correct.
Are the males also selecting females based on any qualities, or is just any female is fine for them?
No. Absolutely. For selection of mates, males pick certain qualities of females and females pick certain qualities of males. The strength of selection, though, is stronger for females making the right choice than for males making the right choice. So this falls under sexual selection as a field of animal behavior, where we're trying to understand how the males and females make choice decisions. And so my short answer is, of course, males are not making randomly either. They're also making choices. and the quality of the female does matter.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Nafisa, your question here, is it because of the higher cost of reproduction for females compared to males? In the description that we just had here, absolutely. Right? Females have fewer eggs. And so they have to be really careful about who fertilizes those eggs. They usually have fewer opportunities to make compared to males. I'm generalizing here. There's, of course, variation from taxa to taxa. And so, but in principle, what you're saying is correct. There is a higher cost for reproduction for females, and so that's why females are choosier than males. This is all under the field of sexual selection, and not the behavior or the context I'm going to talk about today. Okay. All right. So I want to go to section 2 now. If we're all comfortable with natural selection, shaping behaviors like it shapes all phenotypes, then let's think about how we study animal behavior, right? So the framework of animal behavior. So Nico Tinbergen in 1963, he published this paper entitled "On the Aims and Methods of Ecology," and excuse me, what he did was he organized animal behaviors into the way we ask the questions. So here's 4 different kinds of questions. So the first question is, what is the mechanism that provides the immediate stimulus for the behavior? The second question is, how has the behavior developed over the animal's lifetime? So the second question, as you see here, implies that animals aren't born doing everything perfectly. So that as they're developing and as they're going from young to sexually mature to older, then their behaviors also change, which of course makes sense, right? When you're young, you have no reproductive requirements. And so then your behaviors are shaped by what you need at that life stage. And then as you develop, you start to add more behaviors and drop other behaviors. So if you're young, you need to hide more until you learn good anti-predator strategies. As you're older and you're bigger, maybe you can hide less, and now you're focused on getting reproduction or finding a potential mate or creating a nest. So behaviors change over an animal's lifetime. And so we can ask questions about how it's changed and how it's developed over the animal's lifetime, which is different from the first question, which is, how do they actually do the behavior? So what is the mechanism that provides the behavior? So what is it that the animal is seeing in the world or hearing in the world that is allowing it to react with a behavior? So what is stimulus in the environment? What is the stimulus in the body? So mechanisms are different from developments. The third kind of question is, what is it for? Right? What is the behavior for? In other words, how does the behavior affect survival and reproduction? Does it have a benefit? If it doesn't have a benefit, we shouldn't expect to see it at all, right? So what is it for? And the final question that he asked is, how does the behavior change over evolutionary history? It's a time question like the development question number 2, but it's over evolutionary history with the assumption that behaviors are evolving, that animals today behave in a way that is different from their ancestors many generations ago, right? Or many generations. So we can think about how evolution has shaped the behaviors today. So these 4 kinds of questions we can organize in this sort of way. I'm taking them and I'm giving them 4 different words now. So 4 levels of analysis, and this approach here, the way we're organizing this, it has been proposed by several, and I've got a citation below of a fairly recent paper now. It was published in Trends in Ecology, where they organized it like this. So the ontogeny level, right? How does the trait develop in humans? In individuals, sorry. And so that's the ontogeny, the development over the lifetime. The mechanism question, what is the structure of the trait? How is it controlled? The phylogeny question, what is the evolutionary history of the trait? Was it always like this? Or has it changed over time? And finally, what is it for? How have variations in the trait interacted with environments to influence fitness? So these 4 levels, ontogeny, mechanism, phylogeny, and adaptive significance, is all related to understanding why do we see the behavior we see today. So when I started, I said ethology, the field of animal behavior, when it was first descriptive, what scientists were doing was describing animal behavior. Now what scientists are doing is trying to explain why the behaviors even exist. Why do we see it in the way that we do today? Not just what is it, right? What is it is descriptive. Ethology, which is wonderful. First we have to do what is it, then we have to say now, why is it even here? Why is it here? Is it because it developed in a certain way? Is it because the body is structured in a way to give you that kind of behavior? Is it because over evolutionary time, it became more and more complex? And so what you see today is really a complex version. Or is it because it gives the animal some advantage? Right? And our job is to figure out what is that advantage, what is the mechanism, how did it develop in the animal, and how has it changed over evolution? This is what behavioral ecologists try to do today. Now, in this organization, we can think about this as types of explanations. Right? 4 ways of answering why is the behavior the way it is today. So the types of explanations can be proximate, which means mechanistic. What is the structure of the trait? How is it controlled? And how did it develop? Are proximate explanations, which is different from evolutionary or ultimate explanations. So evolutionary or ultimate explanations are what is it for and how is it changed over evolutionary time? So how does evolution shape it? So we can organize these 4 in terms of proximate and ultimate. If you notice, there's also an element of time here. So these 2, the ontogeny and phylogeny, is across developmental or historical time, right? Ontogeny is across development time, and phylogeny is across historical time, right? How has it changed over time? The mechanism and adaptive significant level of question is within a single time. Right? How does it do it today, right now? What? How does the that ant, the ant that cuts out the leaves, right? The leaf cutter ant. How does it cut out the leaf? Right? Well, that's because its mandibles are shaped in a way that allows them to cut. Right? That's how it does it. Right? What is it for? Well, it gives it food. So those are within the single phase or within the single time, as opposed to how has it developed in individuals from when it hatched to adulthood. Or did all ants cut leaves? Or is it something that evolved with time and leaf cutter ants did, and then it became more and more complex? So we can organize what is the behavior here, why is the behavior here, into Tim Bergen's 4 levels of analysis. And the proximate and ultimate vocabulary, by the way, was first raised by Ernst Mayr. So when we talk to each other as behavioral ecologists or animal behaviorists, and when we think about animal behaviors, we have to be careful that we're talking at the same level. Otherwise, we could have 4 different answers for the same question, which is, why is the behavior here? So because there are different ways to explain a behavior, we must be clear when we communicate to each other what level we're talking at, right? We need to be careful about which level of analysis we're considering. And in fact, we should aim to try and answer a behavioral question at all levels. So let's do this exercise together now. Okay, and take a minute. So the question is, why do birds sing in the breeding season? Singing is a behavior, right? And we see singing in passerine birds and lots of species of birds during the breeding season. So can we answer that question in 4 possible ways? 2 ways that are proximate explanations, which is what is the cause or the mechanism of singing itself? Or what is the ontogeny or development of singing? Right? Who sings? Adults sing, right? Babies don't sing songs. Babies call, chicks call, but adults sing. So is there a development component to the singing? Can we answer this question at the ultimate level? What is the adaptive advantage or the function of the singing? What does the bird get out of it? Right? Or evolutionary history. How has singing evolved over time? So let's take 2 minutes and try and come up with possible explanations at all 4 of these levels. I'll let you write it down and then we'll share as a group. Are there any questions about what I'm asking you to do? Is it clear? Okay. I see no hands for questions. So, okay. All right. Okay. So give me 4 possible explanations at the different levels. And then we'll share.
For the reason why they sing in the breeding season, am I audible?
Yes. Are you starting to give us answers? Great. We can pause and start giving the answers now. I was going to call open, but sure. Nafisa, go ahead.
So a lot of birds tend to sing in the breeding season, and in India, it's usually during the monsoons.
Right.
So could it be because of the way the habitat is during the monsoon season, like the habitat which they're in?
Okay.
Like,
where does that fit? That's great. So the habitat changes.
Yes.
And it's a trigger for them to sing.
Yes.
Which of these explanations does that answer fit?
Causation.
Causation. I agree with that. Why? So the habitat changes, and
Yes.
that is a trigger or a signal. Actually, I wouldn't use the word signal. That's a cue to sing.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Hold on. Let me try and get someone else. Okay. Anybody want to give me a potential ontogeny or development level answer?
Hello.
Yes.
Ma'am, it can be because of the development of the vocal cords in different type of species. Like some birds may have different structures of vocal cords. So they produces different songs or different type of sounds rather than some which lack these type of organs.
So during when they're young, their vocal cords are different.
Yes.
And then as they sexually mature, their vocal cords change? Is that what you're saying? Okay. So vocal cords change during sexual maturity. And then that allows them now as adults to sing. Okay. Okay, that's possible. I would also feel like putting vocal cords as a causation. Like how can they sing is because their vocal cords are shaped the way it is. But you went one step further to say the vocal cords have to actually change in a way during development. And that's perfectly possible. Okay. Anybody else want to give me proximate explanations? So the first half, proximate explanations that we haven't already provided.
Ma'am,
in the first part,
Sorry, let me hear
regarding
from Jyotika first. And then, oh, Venu, who was it? I heard a woman's voice. So let me hear the woman's voice first, and then that's the one I heard first.
ma'am, during
Yeah.
the breeding season, maybe it might have been difficult for every within the species to find out where they're staying or where they are situating. So, like that way, they developed to identify where the species or the members are in the huge habitat. Is that why?
That's a good answer. But which of these questions is that answering?
Is it adaptive advantage?
Correct. It's the function, right?
Okay,
What is it
okay.
for? It's to find each other.
Mm.
So that's a function, right? Not
Oh, okay.
it's a so it is a potential answer. So we sing, the birds sing in the breeding season so that they can find each other. Totally fine. But it's at the adaptive advantage or the function level.
Oh,
Okay.
you have to approximate. Okay, so
Right? It's an
sorry.
ultimate explanation. You see what I mean?
Okay, okay. And
Anyone else? And so there was another voice earlier. Anyone else?
yes, ma'am. Ma'am, regarding proximate explanation, can we say like the cue that the bird receives could be some hormonal level changes in the body that is stimulating a neuronal response and resulting in this behavior, singing behavior?
Absolutely. Cues, the environmental cues, right? The environmental cues stimulate neurons in the sensory system, which stimulate hormones, which tell the brain and the vocal cords to sing. That is absolutely approximate explanation because it's a how can they sing, not a why can they sing. So that's very good. Anyone else? Okay, let's move to ultimate explanations. So one that was already posed is to find each other. What other adaptive advantage or evolutionary history level answers could there be? So adaptive advantage, let's think about it. Why do birds even sing? What do they get out of it? What's the benefit?
Is it because they get mate to reproduce and their offsprings can be produced?
To let's see, attract a mate. Right, that's the adaptive advantage, right? To attract a mate, and so therefore pass its genes on. Okay. Any other adaptive advantage?
Territorial defense as well, like amongst competing males.
Okay. To win aggressive encounters, right?
Yes.
All right. Those are great adaptive advantage or function. Like, why do you do this? And then finally, evolutionary history. What are potential answers there?
Ma'am, maybe the cost of this behavior to attract the mates would be over the time they realize that it is lesser. So they adapted this behavior over time.
I see. So birds used to fight before, and then they're now resolving conflict through song. Is that what you mean?
Yes, ma'am. Like the
Yeah.
cost involved.
The cost involved, right? And so it's less costly to sing to resolve conflicts than it is to do other things to resolve conflicts, right? Like fight, etc. Okay,
Yes,
so that means over evolutionary history, song became more and more common, and other ways to resolve conflict, like fighting, for example, became less. That's a possible. Anything else?
Ma'am, they might have realized it's a unique feature, like within not every organism can sing. So
Correct. So what should we see over evolutionary history?
so they found that it is easy method, because since they're also arboreal, it can be easily heard.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You should have seen just calls before, or simple noises before, or no noise at all. And over evolutionary history, you see more and more complex sounds that become song. Because not everyone can, which means if you look now at, sorry, here we are. My slides don't feel like turning. Here. If we look now at a phylogeny of birds or a phylogeny of vertebrates, like you said, not everyone can sing. And so then over evolutionary time and what you see today, singing got more and more complex, or went from simple sounds to full songs, right? Over time. And it's not like if you look back at time, everyone could sing. So that's the evolutionary level question. And we can answer all these, why do birds sing? And this is a paper in 2013 that uses bird song as an example to break down Tinbergen's 4 just the way we did together, to explain all 4 levels of analysis, the mechanism level, that the brain is wired in a certain way. And by getting stimuli from the environment, which could be the onset of spring, or it could be monsoon here in India, or it could be hearing other individuals sing, it makes the song center in the brain is triggered. It goes to the vocal cords. Right? It also goes to the respiratory system, right? And allows the bird to sing in response. That's a mechanism, which is a how do birds sing kind of question. Right? We also can answer another kind of how do birds sing question through development, that young chicks don't sing full songs, but they have to learn those songs from adults, and often their parents. So how do they sing? Is because they learn. Because their brain is wired in a certain way and stimuli triggers it. Why they sing is because it gives them an adaptive advantage through fighting or through mate attraction. And that's why they sing, because that's the fitness related trait. And why they sing is because it evolved from simple sounds to complex songs. So 2 questions, the proximate questions, are all how kind of questions. How does the behavior expressed? And the ultimate or evolutionary level questions are the why kind of questions. Okay, now of course, these levels of explanation are not alternatives, right? All those answers you gave are potential hypotheses and potential explanations, and they're complementary. Together, they provide a complete biological explanation. So when we think of why birds sing, we actually can answer it like we did together at all these levels, and we should aim to do so. And so what?
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah,
Sorry, I
Yes.
have a question.
of course.
Ma'am, does the song, the complexity of the song and the loud noise represents the fitness, total fitness of a bird, or might a less fit bird can mimic the strong bird and attract males? Or is it possible like not fit bird can also like mimic or learn the sounds from the fit one?
Yeah. It depends on the species, but by using the term less fit, we're already saying that they can't do it as well. Correct? So what you're suggesting here is, can you cheat if you're, less fit, in the sense that you actually, we have to talk about what you mean by fit also, right? So I'll come to a fitness definition in a minute. But here, if you're saying that, they have less energy, for example, or their genetic quality is not so good, then is it possible for them to overcome that and learn? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on how hard it is to be able to overcome the constraints that they have, and to actually sing an attractive song that someone who is strong and healthy can. So it depends. In some species, you can cheat. In others, you cannot.
Okay,
so-
thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Like it may
Ma'am,
be
can
the
I have an
possibility.
explanation?
I'm sorry? 1 second.
Ma'am, can I add something?
Yes.
Ma'am, like just the Venu said, if we consider the fact that the cue is coming from the hormones, or the signals are the hormones, then if that hormone is a reproductive hormone, obviously the fittest individual will produce in high amount, and it will cause a high volume or high pitch signals, which in the unfit male, it cannot be seen.
Correct. So some things are constrained, right? So this mechanism, for example, it allows the animal to perform the behavior, right? Of course, we're not just saying, do you sing or not? This is a very simplistic thing, but you're already realizing that you can sing in various ways, correct? You can sing loud, you can sing soft, you can sing long, you can sing, but there's differences in individuals in the quality of the song. So the proximate mechanism can be asked at various levels too. It allows the animal to perform the behavior. It also explains the variation between individuals, variation between individuals in the quality of that behavior. So if we're thinking about hormones as a possible mechanism, and individuals vary in their different hormone levels, then the quality of their song is going to vary correspondingly. Or if in early development, some individuals developed under stressful conditions, and so then as a consequence, their vocal cords or their strings developed poorly compared to other individuals, or they didn't get the right kind of nutrition during development to be able to shape their vocal cords well. Both of those proximate explanations would influence the quality of that song, not necessarily whether they can sing or not, right? They all can sing, but the quality of the song is going to be influenced by some of these proximate mechanisms. So you're right. Okay. So I want to pause and allow us to sort of take stock of where we are now. The fact that we're talking about animal behavior, but for us to think about animal behavior, we actually have to think like integrative biologists. We have to think about genetics, which is what are the genes that encode that behavior. So for song, we really are thinking genes that shape the vocal cords, genes that influence the kind of brain mapping in the song center of birds, genes that influence the sensory system so that they can identify stimuli. Because it's the genes that allow you to develop all these traits, right? The brain, the muscle, the sensory system, all of that, so that you can react, right? And it's the genes that are going to be passed on from generation to generation. So animal behaviorists, behavioral ecologists use genetics or need to understand genetics. They also need to understand developmental biology, right? Because we're talking here about how the brain developed from young to adulthood, or how the morphology, the muscles developed. We think about physiology, right? There was so much discussion about hormones and neurons here. Right? So of course, you can't sing unless you're producing testosterone. And so then we need to think about hormones and where it's produced and where it goes and where the receptors are. We can think about neurobiology because so much of behavior is integrated and understood from the brain. And of course, we think about it as ecologists, right? You don't sing as a bird all year round. You sing in the spring. You sing loudly in some habitats and softly in others. That's all ecology. And we have to think about evolution, of course, because singing just didn't magically appear today. It evolved to become more and more complex so that it is what it is in its complexity. So I love animal behavior as a field because even though all we're doing here is watching the behavior, really trying to understand why that behavior is the way it is and has come to be. And we need to be integrative in our answers. Right? And this is what Tim Bergen suggested to us in the 70s. And it's a really great approach for us to understand animal behavior. Now, I want to make sure that as scientists, as ecologists, we avoid two things. We avoid anthropomorphism, which means we want to avoid labeling the actions of non-human animals as human-like. So this picture I have here is a female gorilla with her young. So we could look at this and say, that's love. Now that would be a very human vocabulary, right? But we can look at this and say that's parental care and describe this as a scientist, the cost, the benefit, the development, the evolution of parental care. And that would be very systematic and clean science. But the moment we start using vocabulary like love, that's a lot more complex. And it's a lot human. And I want us to make sure that we avoid vocabulary like that. Right? It's not to say that animals don't love, but it's a concept that is difficult to quantify and analyze and understand. We can in human societies, because we can talk to each other and we can use language to describe these complex emotions. There's of course an emotion here. What? Parental care has emotions to it. The female's producing dopamine and serotonin, which are really love-like hormones. And they're surging through her brain as she's caring for her young. But we don't need to rely on vocabulary that's human-like. Right? So we should avoid that as scientists. We can still describe all behaviors that seem very similar to ours, but using the right kind of vocabulary. We should also avoid explanations of behavior that are good for the group. So for example, here's a picture of meerkats. Meerkats are quite famous for a lot of things. One thing is that they live in social groups, in large societies, kind of like humans. They've got large societies, they've got hierarchies, they've got family groups, they've got all of that, and they live together. And one observation that scientists have made is that when meerkats see a predator or they see some danger, they give out alarm calls. So like these really loud alarm calls. Has anyone heard that? That meerkats alarm call when they see dangers? And if you have, do you know why?
They have a particular sentry who like usually warns them when they see so he's usually like he sees a predator and then he warns the others and then they all run away.
Correct. So that's a good for the group thing, right? Like that one sentry, the guard that is standing out there is calling out and saying, danger, danger. That is a very risky thing for that guard to do. It's drawing attention to himself. Everybody gets to run away. Huh? And one explanation, which is a good for the group kind of explanation, is that he's being altruistic and saving everyone else at the risk of himself. Now, humans are notorious for being altruistic, right? We're kind, we help each other. And as human societies, we can explain all of that with complex social systems. But why should animals be kind and help each other? So I want us to avoid using explanations that evoke that sort of answer. And because most behaviors that benefit others also benefits the individual that's doing it. And so when we think of behaviors like this one, which is like a kind of behavior, right? Where the guard is calling out when he sees a predator and it allows everyone to hide, seems to be a very sort of risky thing to him, but actually it does benefit him, the guard, for making the alarm call. For multiple reasons. One, he's already seen the predator. So actually, he has first info and can run and hide too. So it's not like he's standing there and sacrificing himself while everybody else is running. He sees it. He will make the call. Everyone runs, but so does he. So that benefit is that the individual is also seeing the predator and can react appropriately. Another benefit of alarm calls, that's what we're talking about here, right? Alarm calling, because in one hand, you could be quiet, you could see the predator, be quiet and go run and hide, correct? And we're finding that alarm calling is a weird thing to do because you're drawing attention to yourself and you're warning others. Now, why warn others? If those others share your genetic material, if they're your family, if you're your kin, you're young, especially you're young, then by giving them the warning, when you know there's a danger, it allows them to survive and pass on copies of your genes, which you share with them. Now, this is idea, apologize. Here we go. This idea has come from a whole slew of literature that's associated.
Hi, Maria.
We lost
see
my
the
slides.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, 1 second. We lost my slides. Let's go back to Zoom and share content. How about now?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. So we can explain things like altruistic behavior through things like kin selection, right? That they're saving copies of their genes in kin and not just being kind. So most behaviors that seem to be good for the group are also good for the individual doing it. Right? And we must think of benefits as increasing fitness. So we've talked about fitness multiple times already, right? We've all used that. I've used that vocabulary. Some of you have used that vocabulary. I hope that we're on the same page. Fitness. Fitness is not the images that I show here of physical fitness. It's Darwinian fitness, which is reproductive success. And so basically, when we say an animal benefits in terms of having higher fitness than another animal, we're saying it passes down more copies of its genes from one generation to the other. So alarm calling, which seems like an altruistic, dangerous thing to do, can still increase the fitness of the individual doing it because copies of his genes are in others also. And if those others benefit from his behavior and survive, those others and that individual can pass down more copies of their genes to the next generation. So fitness here has to relate to coming copies of genes. Okay. So what I want to pause in a minute. I think we're going to break for questions very soon because we've now been talking for an hour and 15 minutes. But what I'm going to do now is spend most of our time in this square of the Tinbergen 4, in the adaptive significance square, because this is where behavioral ecologists like to spend their time. We want to know what is the behavior for, which means how has variation in the trait interacted with the environment to influence fitness, to spread in a population, or to give the individual who's doing that behavior a greater advantage. Okay. And of course, what we were saying here, that the foundational premise of a behavior being an adaptation is that it gives an advantage. So our job is to understand how a specific behavior provides the highest fitness to the individual. Okay. What is it for? Why do it? Okay. Now, I think maybe we break for about 5 minutes. So it's 11:15. I'm going to refill my cup of coffee and we will come back at 11:20 and we will do a quick reminder of the scientific method, okay? And then we can test our ability to use it. So let's take a 5-minute break and I will see you all at 11:20. Okay, it's 11:20. I hope we're all back. So I want us, now that we've sort of got all our questions and we want the levels of analysis, and we want to start asking adaptive significance or functional utility level questions, we need to be able to know how to go about designing a study using the scientific method to answer those kinds of questions. So let's do a quick reminder of the scientific method. And I'm opening this up to you. So when we do the scientific method, what are the steps? I'll start by saying we have an observation or a question. Then what happens? That's step one. So for example, we observe birds sing. Then what do we do with that observation? I see a potential answer here on the chat. We note down different parameters in which the observation is made. Okay, that's true. So we have an observation and a question, and that's sort of like the observation is more detailed. But then Nafisa continues to say we form a hypothesis. We do. That is actually step two. So we form a hypothesis, which means we form a potential explanation for that behavior. And then what? Yeah, go ahead.
We try to see ways in which we can collect data for like our observation, how we may the experimental method in order to test the hypothesis, and ways in which we can reject like the null hypothesis.
Okay, so yes, that is actually step 4. And a lot of you are writing here, we have study design or we do an experiment. That's step 4. Step 3 is we have a prediction that basically says, if my hypothesis is right, then under condition X, I should see Y. So basically, we're being more specific here. We think, why do birds sing in the spring, right? Our potential hypothesis that is an adaptive function is that they sing to attract mates. So our prediction should be, if they're singing to attract mates, then they should sing when they see a female, or they should sing, or that singing will bring a female. So the hypothesis is broad, right? The hypothesis is they're singing for this purpose. And the prediction is, if that is true, then when I manipulate the purpose, I should see the outcome. And so then you test this idea, right? With an experimental design or with observations that allow you to separate the different contexts. So what you're saying here, experimental or study design, all is there. Finally, you draw a conclusion from your results. And if your conclusion is not what you thought it would be, what do? If your prediction is not supported, what happens? Do you give up? You do more science, right?
Ma'am, we have to recheck our hypothesis.
Correct. So then if your prediction is not supported, you go back here and say, okay, maybe the singing is not to attract mates, but actually to fight with other males. What? That's a different hypothesis. And so then your prediction says, if that's the case, then when I put two males together, I should see song. And so then your test is, let's put two males together and see, compare it with a male that doesn't have any stimuli and see who sings and what kind of song. So this is how we iterate the scientific method. The scientific method is exactly how adaptationists or people who study animal behavior using the adaptation approach work. So what they do is identify a behavior of interest. Then they construct a functional argument about how that trait or that behavior has adaptive value. That's the hypothesis. Singing has this value, which is attract mates or combat other males. Right? Then we determine if that's the case. If the trait is under optimizing selection, in terms of how it's designed and used. Right? So that's our prediction. So that we have our prediction that says, this is the function of the song. And if that's the case, then you should see it being used under those contexts, or you see it evolve and designed for that purpose. So then we test our predictions. And if the predictions start supported, we iterate back to step 2. So let's go through this process. Right? This is a superb fan-throated lizard who my lab has studied for a while now. And what he does, this is a male of Sarda superba, and he flaps this colorful dewlap almost continuously in the summer. He's obviously taking energy, but he's doing this. Can we come up with potential hypotheses for the adaptive value? Why is he doing it? What is the function of dewlap flapping? So let's come up with some possible reasons.
Ma'am, to regulate the body temperature,
Okay.
internal body temperature.
Okay. Regulate body temperature. Okay. That's his adaptive function, that he's cooling down, right? When he's doing that. Okay. Can somebody else give me another reason? No? No other reason?
Scare off predators.
To scare off predators. Ooh. As opposed to attract them because he's drawing so much attention. But that's interesting, to scare off predators.
It might look scary for some species.
Yeah, sure. No problem.
It might be a territorial thing,
What do you mean by territorial thing?
like it is showing a dominance that this territory belongs to me, to avoid the potential male that can fight with that for the territory.
Okay, so he's defending his territory with his display.
Ma'am, if summer season is like its breeding season, then it may be because of it is showing its mating signals or.
Correct. He's attracting mates or potential mates, right? They're not mates until he actually gets them. So these are 4, we'll stop here. These are 4 hypotheses. So we can actually, as scientists, design 4 different studies to test whether their temperatures are changing when they do that. To test whether predators do get scared when they do that. To see whether they're defending their territory with this display or not. And to attract mates. And so we've actually done this. And I'll show you the kind of study that one can do when we're thinking about whether or not the flap is for defense of territory. If that's what we think the adaptive function is, then we should design a study to see if, in fact, they use it to display under conditions with their potential predators. And so what we did with this, to test this hypothesis, is that we put potential competitors out there. So in the box is a male that is brought into the territory of another male. If the flapping is used to display to potential competitors, they should flap when they see each other. And they do. Yeah. So design studies like this show us that our hypothesis about functional utility, why do this behavior, can be answered when we put them in the scenarios that we think it's for. Okay, all right. So now we've gone through Tim Bergen's 4, and we are halfway through our time together. I want us to get a bit more mathematical and start talking about the idea of optimality. So when I described the adaptationist approach, I was saying that behavioral ecologists who are adaptationists like myself think of behaviors as adaptations that have evolved to increase the fitness of the individual doing it. So then when we ask the question, what is it for? Using Tim Bergen's fourth corner, what is its current utility? The answer should be it gives them a fitness advantage in some context, right? So in this signaling context, bird song and flapping dewlaps allow them to win fights or allow them to attract mates. And by doing that, they are passing on their genes to the next generation, right? And so we can test that. Is it true? Do they actually use it for that purpose? And does that purpose give them an advantage to pass on their genes? So, by the way, for the flapping dewlap, they also flap their dewlap to attract mates. So I can see some of your notes here in the chat say, do they flap for that? They do. They flap to attract mates and they flap their dewlap for competitive reasons. I don't think predators are scared by them, actually. So anyway, so let's think about the word optimal. Oops. 1 second. My slides have chosen to. Okay. We've already had our short break for questions, so I will continue here. Okay. So we think that if natural selection is shaping behaviors, it means that behaviors have gotten better and better and better, right? And that poor behaviors or behaviors that have yielded lower fitness outcomes for individuals are now gone from the population because those individuals passed on fewer copies of their genes. And so natural selection results in behaviors that are better. And by better, we mean optimal for the specific ecological condition. So optimal behavior means that we're maximizing benefits, which is what we're saying all this while, right? Fitness, most number of offspring, right? So what you do gives you the best advantage. But everything is not an advantage, right? We have to also think about costs. So an optimal behavior is one that maximizes the benefits and minimizes the costs. So we should now be thinking about cost and benefit analysis like an economist, someone who's studying money, for example, right? So to use optimality models, we need to know the following, right? What is the decision that the animal has? So what is the behavior that we're trying to understand? What is the currency? So I'm using economic terms here as a behavioral ecologist. What is the currency? What is it trying to get? One thing you can say is it's getting fitness. But how do you measure fitness? You can measure it in terms of the number of offspring, but actually not all behaviors directly relate to that. So for example, what to eat. I can't directly connect what an animal eats today to how many babies it has, how many babies it has is your fitness outcome, right? Once natural selection is shaping behaviors and phenotype so that the individual can have as many babies as possible, pass as many genes, or copies of his genes as possible to the next generation. But how do I connect what you eat to that? What I can connect is how much energy you get. And if I think about it over the long term, how much energy you get, the more energy and more energy you get, then you're going to have more energy to put towards reproduction. So our currency has to be related to the behavior we're focused with. Of course, animals are not unconstrained. They can't do everything, and they can't do everything perfectly. So of course, we need to think about what is it that they're limited by? What is it that they're trying to achieve? And how do they resolve that through their decision? Right? Jyotika, I see your message here about the poison dart frog being poisonous, and they warn their predators through their bright colors. You're absolutely right. Bright coloration can be a warning signal. So in principle, that is a very good hypothesis about the evolution and the use of that bright coloration. We just know from this system that the bright coloration does not seem to deter predators. And so that's why from our own research, we don't see it as a warning coloration, but in other systems, absolutely it is. Okay, so I want to go away from signaling, which we've talked about already for a while with the song and the colors. And I want to ask this very simple question, is what should an animal eat? And in other words, do animals eat everything they see and make random choices about what to eat? Or are they selective, eating some things and not other things? Do we have, what do you think? They're selective. Okay. By selective means they're not eating everything they see, right? So now we have to ask, how do they know what to eat and what not to eat? So let's use the optimality approach to answer this question. So what to eat, right? So we need to think about the decisions, which means we have to select a behavioral option. Right? In other words, should I eat one prey type or more? So if you look at this image here of ungulates, of like zebra and wildebeest, what are they doing? They're grazing. Are they eating every bit of grass, or are they eating some species of grass and not others? So the question here is, should I eat one prey type or more? The currency, when we're thinking about what to eat, is what is the animal trying to achieve? They're just achieving energy, or is it more than that, right? Usually when we think about what are they maximizing, we're thinking about how much energy they can gain in the time that they're spent foraging. Well, if you're going to forage for 5 hours and get very little energy, that's not as good as foraging for 5 hours and getting lots of energy. So what are they trying to achieve? They're trying to maximize the currency of foraging. They're trying to maximize the energy gain over time. But can they do it all? So are there any constraints to being able to get the most amount of energy per time? Are those constraints ecological or biological? So let's look at constraints for a minute. Let me also pause and address some of the things I see in the chat. The suggestion that the animals learn what to eat by learning from their parents or seeing other adults choose diet, that applies for some species, not all. So think about a lot of non-mammals or non-bird species, right? Mammals and birds often live in family groups, or they at least hatch and have their parents nearby. So yes, they can learn what to eat from the adults, either their parents or other adults in the system. But How does a lizard learn what to eat, or a fish, or an insect? It can't learn from social learning, correct? Because they're just going to hatch and then hatch from their eggs and move on. Their parents are not staying there to take care of them, right? By their own wisdoms and environments. So that's exactly what we're talking about here. Right? When we say their own wisdoms, we're really saying that natural selection has shaped decision making in a way that animals can identify what they should and should not eat. And so they don't have to know it by instinct. They can learn, but they don't have to learn from each other. So some of these can be explained by natural selection shaping genes to identify what is edible. And so there's no learning. Some of it is that they have to learn. Nonetheless, they don't have to watch each other necessarily. So most animals that don't live in a social system don't have an opportunity to watch each other. So they still need to know what to eat, what not to eat, right? And so we use optimality to explain this. So now we've got all three, right? The first thing is the decisions, right? What is our behavioral option? Should I eat one thing or more? What is our currency, which is I want to get the most amount of energy over time. And what are my constraints? So let's take a minute to talk about constraints. There are constraints in various forms. There's temporal constraints, which is how much time it takes to find as well as process and handle food. So this picture here of the squirrel with the nut, he may find the nut very quickly, but it would take him time to open the nut and to open the shell, right? And get the food inside. That is constraints. It's a time constraint. It takes a long time to open something hard. And so that's a handling constraint. There's also energetic constraint. There's the metabolic cost, so the energy cost of walking around the environment looking for food. There's the cognitive constraint, right? How much the brain can learn, or how much the brain can remember what is and isn't edible, or where food is, right? Where are the trees that have ripe fruits, right? That only works if your brain is wired in a way to have good spatial memory, or you can remember these things, right? So cognitive constraints can affect how efficient an animal is in terms of its foraging. And of course, there's processing constraints, which is the limit to the type and size of prey that can be processed. So you can't eat something that's too big to fit in your mouth. That's a processing constraint that's quite legitimate, right? So you could see a really large food source, but if you can't eat it because it's too big, then that's a processing constraint. Or you can't eat it because it's toxic. That's a processing constraint. So even though it has a lot of energy in it, it also has some toxins that prevent you from digesting it. That's a processing constraint. So you can have constraints to optimally foraging. That are these four types, right? Your ability to know how much energy you spend while you're looking for it, how much time you have, how much time it takes, and what you can process. Now, given that, let's think about what an animal should eat. And I want to start with a model that Charnoff and Krebs both proposed in the early 70s, and we still use it today, which is the basic model of optimal foraging theory. And it's the simple question of what to eat. So I hope you have your pens and paper with you, because we're going to start to work through the math here. So suppose we have a predator that encounters two prey types and is walking through the environment and it sees both of this. The question to ask is, should it ignore the first predator, the first prey? Should it ignore this and eat just the blue one? Or should it eat the brown beetle when it sees it and then move forward and eat the blue one when it sees it? So how do we answer that? Basically, we're asking, do I eat as a predator? Does an animal as a predator eat everything it encounters? Or should it actually not eat some things and go look for others? That's the difference between an animal that's a generalist that forages on everything versus an animal that is selective. So a lot of you answered when I said, what does an animal eat? Should it ignore some stuff? You said, yes, be selective, which means you're saying, don't eat this one and eat this one only. Our question now is, how do we figure that out? So let's think about the two prey types. Let's think about the blue beetle and the brown beetle. They're obviously different in size here. So let the large prey, what are the characteristics of the large prey? One is how much energy does it have? So let's give its energy value of the blue beetle E1. And let's say that it takes an animal some amount of time to chew it and swallow it. Right? It's big, so it actually takes longer than it does for the brown beetle. So there's a handling time that is H, and there's an energy value that comes from eating the blue beetle. These values are different for the small prey. So the brown prey has an energy value associated with it and a handling time associated with it. So the first thing we do is to think about what the predator is trying to achieve here. It's trying to achieve something called profitability, which means it's trying to achieve prey eating food that gives it the highest energy per time. So the first thing we do is rank these food items based on profitability. Now, in my example here, I'm going to say that the blue beetle, which is bigger, gives it more energy over handling time than the brown beetle, which is smaller. So when it eats the blue beetle, it gets more energy over handling time than when it eats the brown beetle. So I'm going to rank the prey in the environment like this. So blue beetles are better than brown beetles based on energy over time. Everybody following so far? I can't see your heads nod, but okay. So it's a benefit over cost, right? Benefit is the energy. Cost is how much time it takes to grab it and eat it, which is your handling time. So this is our profitability ratio. And I'm already putting an inequality here. So now if the predators want to maximize overall rate of energy gain, then when encountering a prey, should it eat it or ignore it? So we already said in this situation that the blue one is more profitable than the brown one. So our first conclusion should be, every time a predator sees the blue large prey, it should eat it. It should never ignore the profitable one, based first on the fact that the blue one is more profitable than the brown one. Right? So whenever it sees it, it should always eat it. So it should never ignore blue. The question then means is, when do I actually eat the brown one? When should we eat the less profitable prey? So we've refined our question a little bit more, which is not what should a predator eat, is should a predator eat everything in the environment after the profitable one? It should certainly eat the profitable one, right? Eat the profitable prey, but don't eat the other one. Is that case or not? So now we have to work it through. Eat prey 2 only if, so prey 2 is the smaller one, right? Only if what it gets from eating prey 2 is greater than what it gets from rejecting prey 2 and searching for prey 1. So let's think about that for a second, right? Only include the small one if it's better to include it rather than ignoring it and looking for this one. That means it's the gain from looking for the big one. So that means we need one more piece of information. So far, we've only had energy and handling time of the two prey. Now we have to add one more, which is the search time for the profitable prey. Not the search time for the less profitable prey. Because I'm working through book language here first, then we'll do equations. So only eat the less profitable prey if the gain from eating it is greater than from rejecting it and looking for the better one, right? Then searching for the more profitable prey. So let's add that into our equations. What do you get from eating prey 2? You get the energy associated with prey 2 divided by the handling time of eating prey 2. That's what you get if you ate prey 2, correct? That has to be higher. The energy over the handling time of eating prey 2 has to be higher than this ratio, which is the energy of you get from eating prey 1 divided by the handling time of eating the blue one, plus how long it took you to find it. This is the search time for prey 1. So what we're saying is when animals moving through the environment and it sees the brown one, beetle, it sees this, the little brown one, it has to do a calculation that says, this is how much energy I'm going to get if I eat this, as opposed to ignoring it and keep looking for the more profitable prey in my environment, which means the cost in terms of time spent searching for the bigger, more profitable prey. So now we have these two ratios that the animal can resolve. So let's rearrange this so that the search time is on one side of the inequality. When we do that, this is our conclusion, that when should a predator eat the smaller, less profitable prey? It should do that when the search time for this is so high that the gain by searching is not worth it anymore. When the search time is high, too high, that the energy it gets, including the handling time spent eating everything else, it's not worth it anymore. So I'm just reorganizing 5 pieces of information. Energy of both the prey, how long it takes when you're handling them to get that energy into your body, and how long it took to search for just the profitable one. So this is actually interesting because in very simple terms, we took the description of what an animal has to do. Eat everything I see or ignore some things and look for the good stuff. It means that we have some predictions. One prediction is that a forager can specialize. It can eat only one type of prey. And in our situation, we already know that it shouldn't be either. It should be the more profitable one, right? It should be the big blue one. So it can specialize on the big profitable prey or generalize, eat profitable and less profitable. So those are its choices, right? The decision to specialize depends on the abundance of the profitable prey, not the abundance of the less profitable prey. So basically, you're asking the predator whether it should ignore something or not. It only ignores it if it can find the profitable prey faster. So the abundance of the profitable prey, not the abundance of the less profitable prey. Right? And the switch between eating only the big beetle to eating both the big and small beetle depends and occurs very suddenly. It occurs when the big blue beetle is common enough that this inequality holds true. So we can actually, by doing these calculations, predict what a predator should eat in the environment. All we need is this information. We need to know the energy of all the prey in the environment. We need to know the handling time of all the prey in the environment. And we need to know the abundance of, most importantly, of the most profitable prey. So what information do we need, right? We just need S, the abundance of the profitable prey. We need energy of both types and handling time of both types. And once we have those pieces of information, we can actually test optimal foraging theory. Are you following? Do we have questions at this point before I tell you how people have tested this? Any confusions? Okay. All right. I'll take silence here as everyone's following. Okay. How do we test optimal foraging?
Ma'am, I just have one doubt.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so like you say, according to the theory, like the predator or any animal can be either selective or it can be both. I mean, it can be generalist also. Is that, I mean, generalist and specialist also? Is that,
yes.
Is that how we should get this?
Yes. Yes. Now, what we're saying is, of course, you know now that some species today are entire specialists, correct?
Yes, yes.
And so if you're asking, then when would you expect them to be generalists? I don't.
Okay.
Species who are specialists now
Mm-hmm.
have evolved under conditions where the specialist strategy is now fairly fixed and it's the most optimal solution for them. I'm
Okay.
talking about species that can eat a range of things.
Okay.
We're asking, if you can eat a range of things, should you eat it all or should you eat only some of it? Maybe even only one of it.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. So the first test of optimal foraging theory, at least this part of it, which is optimal diet choice, what to eat, was designed by Krebs in 1978. And it's just brilliant study because it was so well controlled. So what Krebs did was he used Great Tits, Paris Major, as his model system. And he tested the model in the exact same way that we just derived. He gave these birds a choice of large or small prey. So he used mealworms that had two different sizes. And the large mealworm was 2 times the size of the small mealworm. And he had to give it to the predator, to the birds, in a way that he could control, right? It couldn't be in the wild. It couldn't just be laid out in the lab. He actually created this conveyor belt. And what the conveyor belt did was it allowed the bird to see these mealworms go by it. And because it's controlled like a conveyor belt, it allowed Craig to adjust search time. So the bird doesn't have to search, but we can think of search time as how long it takes for you to find that prey, right? So it's the same way as saying, how long does it take for that prey to show up in your world? So search time is also, in the real world, can be thought about abundance, right? How if a prey is really abundant, is very common, then your search time is short, right? Because it's quick for you to find it. If the prey is not abundant at all, then your search time is long because it takes you longer to find. So in an experiment like this, he can adjust search time by making the mealworms come after a long time. So the prey, the bird has to wait and wait and wait, and then it comes. Or search time can be short, but the mealworms come by very fast. So we can, as experimental biologists, control this by controlling encounter rate. In an experiment or in the wild, we can understand this by measuring how common or rare the prey is. So I'll show you. So this is the experiment. It's set up. The bird is basically sitting inside the box, and I'll show you a photo of this. He's sitting inside the box, and he can see this conveyor belt in front of it. So the conveyor belt is from here to here, and the mealworm just goes by. And the bird is sitting there and just waiting. Now, if we're testing the optimal diet choice, we need 3 pieces of information, correct? We need the energy of the big and small mealworm. I'm just going to write worm here. What else do we need? Right, this is our E.
Handling time.
We need handling time, right? We need handling time, which is how long it takes the bird to pick up the mealworm and eat. Now, in this experiment, it was very convenient. Handling time was the same for both small and big mealworms. So the E over H that we have here, the H was always exactly the same. It took them about 1 second to just grab it and eat it. But the E, the energy, differed. Twice as energetically valuable in the big one than the small one. What else did we need?
Search time.
Research time.
Search
Yeah,
time, right? And here it's encounter rate. So we need S. Right? So how common each of those play out. So Krebs, in his very controlled experiment, had all 3 pieces of information because he manipulated it, right? And so here's what he did. So he adjusted all these things. He adjusted the rate that the mealworms were coming in. So his first experiment had a low density of prey. It had 6 mealworms come every hour. And so the bird is sitting there and only 6 mealworms would come. And he would expose them to the large mealworm and the small mealworm. And according to the optimal diet choice calculations he did in advance, which is what the ratios we just worked through, he manipulated it so that they would see 50% of the mealworms that would come in would be large and 50% would be small. So it's an even number of large and small. So 3 mealworms were large, 3 were small in that 1 hour. And he predicted that because density was so low, the bird should eat both. It should eat all the large mealworms and all the small mealworms. Because the search time is so high. That means eating all is the better strategy than not eating the small ones. So this was his prediction. So this is what he manipulated. He manipulated the proportion. He manipulated the overall density. And with the calculations that we do, with the inequalities that we just described, this is what he predicted, that the bird should be a generalist. And when he did the experiment, he observed it to be more or less correct, that the observed proportion in the diet was more or less 50-50. Then he adjusted the experiment and he increased the density of the prey. This time, he had 60 mealworms an hour, which is a lot. And he made it so that the large worms were more common than the small worms. So now density is really high. Overall density is really high. And the proportion is that more of the profitable prey is present than the small, less profitable prey. What do you think he predicted? What should the bird do?
It should eat the larger one.
Only or at this
Uh,
ratio?
Only the larger ones.
Only the larger one. Anybody else think it's a different thing? Because one possibility is that it eats everything it encounters still, right? And if that's the case, it should eat, 70% of its diet should be large and 30% of its diet should be the small one. Alternative is what Siddharth just said, which is it should eat only large mealworms. Crabs, because he knows energy and handling time and we've manipulated density, he predicted this, that the bird's best solution should be only eat the large mealworms. And this is what he found. Right? This is the observation in his experiment, that in fact, large mealworms comprise most of the diet, and the birds made some mistakes. Mistakes in the sense that not as we predicted with this calculation, it ate some mealworms. And then he did one more experiment, which is an interesting manipulation. So this second one, okay, is a high density of prey and the large mealworms is more common. So our expectation is do this, right? Eat only the large, specialize. And so that's the experiment I have below. His third manipulation was to have the density be really high. Okay, so 60 mealworms an hour, but this time have the proportion be the same. This means even though everything is common, unlike this one where the experiment below, the more profitable prey was more abundant, this time he's making the small worms also equally abundant. And when he did that, he still predicted that although small mealworms were abundant, the bird should still only eat large. This is a really good test of the optimal foraging theory, because optimal diet choice at least, because what he's doing is he's making the less profitable prey more common. Right? This is the prey that we don't expect to be in the diet at all, right? And it should only be in the diet if it's worth it. So if I make it really common, is it worth it? It turns out no. Even though the less profitable prey is as common as the more profitable prey, the small worms is as common as the large worms, the birds still eat the large worms. And this is the true result, the true support for that result. And finally, he did the final test, which is make the small worms really common and the large worms less common, and everything be a high density. So the fourth test, which is even worse, right? And even with this, the calculation predicts that the predator should only eat the large worms. So if you look at this test, this is saying that the large worms are uncommon in the population, right? It's not as common as small worms. But mathematically, we predict that they should still eat the large ones. And this is what he finds. His observation is that indeed, even though the small worms were really common and more common than the large worms, the birds were still specialists. They ate mostly the profitable prey. So this experiment is actually quite remarkable because it controlled everything that we can't really control in the wild. And it mathematically allowed us to set predictions about what the optimal diet choice would be and to design a test to test those predictions. And he found that those predictions held really well. Right? that actually the general prediction of optimal diet choice is this, that when overall food density increases, lower ranked items, right, smaller prey, are excluded from the diet, even if they were accepted before. So in the first test, everything was uncommon, right? Everything was rare, density was low, and the bird was willing to eat the small one as well as the big one. But when everything became more and more abundant, then predators can be more and more selective. And so this actually means that when you go to a buffet, even though you have a variety of things that you could eat, you actually eat only one or two things. Right? As food becomes more available, foragers become more selective. And it's not just food that becomes more available. If the thing you like eating, suppose it's whatever that is in the buffet, is full, and even if the rest are also full, you're willing to ignore it because you're more profitable. The most profitable or your favorite food on the buffet here it's spelling, more profitable prey or food is common, then that's all you want to eat. So this is like saying my favorite food is cake. And if I had unlimited access to cake, I would eat cake only. And this is the general prediction of optimal diet choice, which should be quite surprising, right? That even though I'm at a buffet and I have all sorts of dessert items, if there's lots and lots of cake, I'm not going to try anything else. So we can generalize to more than two prey types. And for the sake of time, we're not going to do this here, but I'll just show you how we do this. The steps we use to understand what predators should do mathematically is to first rank prey according to the energy overhandling time, right? According to the profitability. That's step one. Understand how these different prey items rank. Then our first conclusion is that the most profitable prey is always in the diet. So never ignore cake when you have it, if you're me. Step two is to determine all the possible diet combinations, which means sequentially add prey to the diet in order of their profitability. So suppose I've got all these beetles in here, okay, and I rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, and I'm ranking them based on their energy overhandling time. That the yellow one has a higher rank than the blue one, than the green one, so on and so forth. So my step two would be to sequentially add prey into the diet in order of this profitability, which means the predator needs to think about, do I eat 1 versus 1 plus 2 versus 1 plus 2 plus 3, and so on and so forth. Right? I'm never going to think about a possible diet where it eats 1 and then 5 and 6, where it ignores 2 and 3. That makes no sense because that's not how the prey are ranked. The prey are ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it should eat 1 only, or 1 plus 2, or 1 plus 3. You never ignore or you never expect, based on the optimality approach that we're using here, you never expect them to ignore profitable ones and skip to less profitable ones. So we rank first, then we order the possible diets, and then we calculate the energy gain by sequentially adding the prey in this rank order. And so that's how we can use optimality to figure out what should predators eat. Right? And so the conclusion should be eat another prey, so K plus 1. So if K is, I'm eating 1 and 2, as long as the equation holds. Now we could use the equation I used before, but the equation I first showed you was only for 2 prey types. So we can make it more complicated. by including it sequentially. And so here's a kind of equation that we can use that still has energy over time, right? I'm just using different terms here. So it's the energy of each prey over the time multiplied by P, which is the proportion of food items that are each of those things. So the proportion of yellow ones multiplied by the energy it gets by eating the yellow ones, divided by the time it takes to handle, right? So this is pursue, handle, swallow the yellow beetle. I've added a couple of other things that we didn't put before, which is more costs, right? So far we simplified, like Krebs and Chernoff, when they first developed this model, they simplified it to not have much cost. But there are costs, right? There's cost in terms of energy you spend as a predator moving through the environment to search. Right? Movement has an energy cost. So we have to subtract the search cost, multiplied by how much time they're spending searching. And so all the energy that is spent getting the food that they get while eating the food, subtracted by all the energy they spend trying to get that food, multiplied by how long they spend looking for that food. That is the gain in terms of overall E, right? Overall energy, divided by the loss in terms of time, right? Loss in time. And so we can add, all the time spent handling plus the time spent searching for food in the denominator. So I'm not going to, we're not going to work through this right now, but what I want you to do is, this is homework. If you're keen and you want to try your hand at this calculation, this is a potential homework for you. And once you're done, you're welcome to email me your answer and I'll tell you how well you've done. Okay, so suppose we have 3 prey types in the environment and their abundance is the following. The number available in the habitat are 20, 30, and 50 for food type 1, 2, and 3. That means I can convert the number available into proportion. So 0.2 is the availability of food type 1, 0.3, and 0.5. Now, suppose I knew the energy in terms of calories for each of these food types. And so we say that food type 1 has 4 kilocalories, food type 2 has 2, and food type 3 has 1. And it takes them different amount of time. It takes the predator different amount of time to handle it, right? So that's what your handling time is here. And at the top right corner, I have some numbers that we can use for how long it takes to find each prey. So suppose it takes 1 second to find the next prey items, and it costs you 0.1 kilocalories per second in terms of search cost. Assume this is the world that a predator lives in, and these are the parameters associated with the food available to that predator. Our question is what to eat. Right? Do I eat all 3 types? Or should I just eat 1? Or should I eat 2 out of the 3? So step 1 is what? Rank each of these by profitability. Right? And so rank all 3 of these based by E over T. So I'm going to wait a minute while you do that, because that's a simple calculation. Right? 4 over 1, 2 over 1, 1 over 2. Everybody following? Yes, no questions so far? So step 1 is to do that and to rank them all. Once we do that, we know that food type 1 is ranked higher then food type 2, then food type 3. So what is the first conclusion that we can draw given this ranking? What should always be in the diet of the predator? Correct, right? Food type 1 should always be in the diet. Now, what you need to do is quickly write these numbers down so that if you want to do this for homework, then you need to decide whether the predator eats 1 plus 2, right? Food type 1 and 2 because it's ranked. Or should it eat 1 plus 2 plus 3? And that's the homework I'm going to leave you with. It means that we need to calculate the gain that the predator gets by eating food type 1 only versus the gain that it gets by eating food type 1 and 2 versus 1 plus 2 plus 3. And that will tell us what the predator should do. Should it ignore 3 or should it include 3? Should it ignore 2 or should it include 2? Okay. All right. If you need me to send this via email and you haven't written the numbers down, you can let us know and I'll do that. All right, so let's be clear about our assumptions. So optimal diet is actually really powerful, right? It allowed us to think about something complex like what to eat and ask an important question, which is, are animals eating randomly or not? And it suggests that animals are not eating randomly and are certainly not eating everything they see. And we can think about what parameters matter. And once we lay out our argument mathematically, we can test it experimentally and even in the wild. But we have to know what assumptions we're making when we do models like this. Right? We're assuming that the forager, the predator, can actually assess the value of the food upon encounter. It can look at that beetle and know what the energy is and what the handling time is. Because if it doesn't know that, then it can't do the profitability calculation. Right? The forager also has to know the set of foods that are available in its habitat, which means it has to accurately rank prey according to E over handling time. Because if it can't do that, then it can't follow the optimality models that we are proposing here, right? Which is only eat the highest rank or eat the highest and next highest rank, so on and so forth. If it can't rank, then it can't do that. Right? We're also assuming that the forager searches randomly and that food is randomly distributed, which means we have a measure of search time. That we can vary this. Like in the models I have, I've made search time as fixed per foraging bar, but that might not be the case. Sometimes it's easier to find some things and harder to find others. I've also made my model so that the energy cost is fixed, but we can manipulate that to say that sometimes it's more energetically expensive to find some foods versus others. These can be manipulated. It just means making our equation a little bit more complex, but it's not like we can't handle that mathematically, right? But we also have realized that animals are not perfect, right? They're not perfectly adapted to their environments. They also don't control the assumptions that we're making here. We're assuming that they know a lot of things, that they know where to find food, how much that food is ranked, how's the energy gain. What we are saying that natural selection is the mechanism that works to maximize these processes. Right? It's the mechanism that works as a maximizing process, and it's specific to the local condition, which means an animal evolving in this habitat has had many, many generations to encounter the food, at the range of food, and make some rules and understand what the energy and the handling time and availability is of these foods. So there's some learning here, and that learning is shaped by natural selection. There's also some instinct here that animals have evolved to be able to look at the size of a prey, for example, and instantly know that this size means this energy, or this size means this handling time. Now, if you remember, in Krebs's beautiful experiment with the birds and the mealworms in captivity, even though he predicted that when he made the abundance, overall abundance really high, and certainly the abundance of the large mealworms high, that the birds should not eat the small ones at all. But they did, right? All those bars were his observations. There were some small worms that were still eaten. What do we do when we see results like that? Why is that a mistake on the animal's point? And if it is a mistake, does it mean that optimal foraging theory or optimal diet choice is wrong and that we need a better model? So some people say that yes, if you don't perfectly find if your result don't perfectly match your predictions, then the hypothesis is wrong. But actually, as behavioral ecologists or people who study animal behavior, we know that there are lots of constraints, and that knowledge of the environment and the food options is not perfect. Animals still has to learn what is there, and the world is variable, right? So even if they learn today, here's all my food options, and here's the energy, and here's the time, and here's the handling, and here's the search, it could change tomorrow. So knowledge of the environment is not perfect. And so mistakes are expected to happen, right? Natural environments are changing and variable and often unpredictable. So the fact that despite this, the fact that knowledge of the environment is not perfect and that natural environments are changing is actually quite cool that Krebs found such clean results. And lots of people have tested this, and most people find really clean support for optimal diet choice when they test it. There's also other things that we're underestimating, right? When I said that we assume that animals are randomly foraging, that's not true. Animals typically search efficiently, not randomly. And so I think what we want to do is when we see less than perfect matches to our predictions, we want to remember that there are lots of other things in play. There are some constraints about cognition. And there's some other aspects about our assumptions that we need to modify or adjust or remember about real animals in the real world. Okay, so I want to summarize. Whenever we do any optimality sort of approach, we use this model building process. We determine the currency. Here is the net energy gain per unit time, right? This is the currency that is being optimized. Get the most amount of energy per time. We determine the constraints, the energetic, time, ecological constraints, and then we model it in the parameters of that constraints. And so if we fail to identify all constraints or the precise nature of these constraints, we actually have really bad models, because then we're expecting the animal to do what it cannot. Or if we think there are more constraints that's really there, then we're expecting the animals to do things within a really tight framework when actually it can do more. So we need to spend a good amount of time understanding our animal, whatever our model system is, so that we can identify the constraints or the nature of those constraints, right? Then finally, with any model building process, we determine the appropriate decision rule, right? So for here, our example is that a test of optimal foraging compares the observed diet with all possible diets, given the constraints of foraging in the environment. That's what we've done. We see what the animal is eating, given that it has option A, B, C, D, and E, right? In the variation that it sees it in the environment, right? So we mathematically first determine what we should see and then empirically test, which is really quite remarkable. Now, I want to spend the last little bit talking about graphs. How do we graphically represent optimality? Right? So in our example here, in our first example, we were saying eat this or that. But I can also think about it as how long do I spend eating? So if I was going to draw an optimality model, I'm drawing two things, right? When I said optimal, I said energy over time as a ratio. I'm saying benefit over cost. So we were to think about optimal foraging in terms of how long should an animal eat? Do I eat all day long, or should I stop eating after a while? What do you think the shape of this graph would look like? Right? The x-axis is time spent foraging.
Ma'am, a typical bell-shaped graph, maybe.
Do you have a paper? Can you draw it and turn on your video?
Okay, ma'am, I'll try.
Others as well? Will you draw an energy gain over time spent foraging? And then whenever you're ready, you can turn on your video and share it with the group. Okay, so you have drawn this. Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what you're saying is that as you increase the time spent foraging, you're getting more and more and more energy until a certain point where when you increase, you actually lose energy. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am, because at a point we have a cost benefit ratio of 1, which is the maximum. After that, if energy is getting high, we have also time getting increased, so that will increase the value.
But you're still getting more food though, right? So why do you lose energy?
But ma'am, we are also spending energy in searching the food.
But they're spending energy searching the food here too. Correct? As you, right?
Yes, ma'am, but the time is not that much.
Time is not that much. Okay. I know what you're trying to say. Is there another way to draw this graph? Does anyone have a slightly different version of this graph? You're on the right track. Anyone else?
Ma'am, maybe this will not follow a perfect parabolic graph.
Okay. Sorry, I can't see your video. Can you turn on your video and share with us, or at least verbally describe?
Ma'am, video I have not made.
Okay, so describe to me what your graph would look like.
And maybe it will not be like perfect parabola, I'm saying.
It would not be perfect, but what?
Perfect parabola shape.
Perfect parabola shape. Which is this? You're saying
Yes, ma'am.
like a little bit more variation like that?
Maybe, ma'am.
Okay. So this is a possibility, an optimality model that says that this is how much time you spend foraging because this is the highest gain per time, right? Because that's the ratio we want. Anything more time is less energy. Another way we can predict this is that you gain energy as you go, as you eat. The more you eat, you're gaining energy. And after a while, the slope slows down and you gain less energy. You are gaining, but not that much until a threshold is reached. So then that could also still result in an optimal energy per unit time. Both of these are possible. That you could actually lose energy over time, or you could just saturate. It depends on the system, and it depends on how much energy is used and gained during foraging. So we can graphically represent optimality models like this. It assumes that when we're done with our graph thinking about cost and benefit, we have a point in here that says this is the best thing to do. This is the optimal time because it's the most amount of energy for the time span. It also means that we shouldn't forage forever, and we shouldn't forage too little either. Okay. We come back to our little dewlap flapping friend. And we can think about optimality in the same way. Any behavior can allow us to think about optimality. So we can ask, what is the dewlap flap rate? Should you flap a lot or flap a little? And we should think about this in terms of both benefits and costs. So benefits could be the more I flap, the more females I get. The benefit would be female attraction. Okay. So the more I flap, the more females I get. The cost could be the more I flap, the more energetically expensive it is, right? So the cost would be energy, and the benefit would be some gain. As long as we think about optimality in this way, where we've got benefit functions and cost functions, we can always predict what the optimal dewlap flap rate is, or the optimal behavioral response is, in terms of energy over time, or in terms of fitness gain over fitness loss. And so we can use this approach, optimality, as a way to study any behavior that is a continuous behavior, right? Like flap rate, amount to eat, right? And that has both a cost and a benefit associated with it. Okay. I'm going to pause and take questions. And then I want to see what else. Okay, that's it. Actually, I'm done. So I will pause now and take questions about anything I've said so far, or anything about animal behavior that you want. What you should have realized by now, that what we've done is we've taken an approach, which is Tinbergen's 4. We've broken it down, and then we focused on fitness as a measure of understanding adaptive function. And we used one way of studying animal behavior, optimality, to solve one problem. So I will pause and take any questions you have.
Hello, ma'am. I have a few questions.
Mhm.
The first question is that in a slide, it was mentioned that the foragers do mistakes. So it is true for me to say that they don't mistake actually. Like for example, if we have to take an example that a cat is ignoring a larger mice instead of a shorter mice, it can be because of the larger mice must have any kind of infection or which is not fit for diet. That's why it was ignored. So
Okay.
whether it is true or...
No, you're right, but you can model that, right? So when our profitability was energy over time, correct? And so we ranked the big mouse and the small mouse in your story here. The big mouse is not healthy or it's sick. So actually, its gain over time may be low than the small one. We can include those sort of things in our equation, right? Right here, I was only saying energy over time, but I can make the profitability of a prey by lots of measures, right? Its value, if it's sick and it's has a disease, then its value is low than a healthy smaller thing. So we can rank prey based on its disease content. And it would still mean that we can still model it. So it's still not a mistake, right? It would actually be the correct decision, the optimal decision to avoid something toxic or dangerous. We can make our equation include that sort of stuff.
Okay, thank you. Ma'am, my another question is about innate and adaptive behavior. Like any adaptive or learned behavior can become an innate behavior in due course of time?
Yes. So, yes, absolutely. So when we say innate, we're saying that there's no learning, right? That it just knows what to do. Now, if genes are encoding the behavior and those genes increase in the population and eventually get fixed, then that becomes innate already. Because if the gene is encoding the behavior to, I will always eat red things, and there's a gene for that, okay? Or a set of genes that I see red things and I will always eat red things, for example. And if it benefited the individual to have the gene to always eat red things, and eventually it ends up spreading, that gene spreads in the population, so it's fixed, then that is actually innate. Then there's no learning left because everyone has that gene to eat red things. So absolutely. So the innate behaviors we see today have been shaped by natural selection, could have begun as learning, and then became more and more fixed when there was more genetic encoding for it. And so therefore becomes innate now.
Yes, ma'am. So for a trait to be an innate behavior, it must be onto the genes, translated up to the gene.
Everything.
So how, like, for example, if there are two dogs and the dog which produces a weeping sound gets more food instead of a dog who is wagging its tail. So how this trait is, translated into the gene so that the weeping behavior becomes an innate behavior.
Yeah.
Is there any model or any study done on?
So things like that is that, so there has to be variation in individuals in what sounds they can make, right? And so if there's no genetic encoding for the different kinds of sounds that the dogs make, then each generation, they would have to learn from each other, right? There'll be overlap with individuals. So this generation, some started making some sounds by luck, and there's no genetic encoding. The next generation, they have to learn. And you can still have those different sounds, the successful sounds like the weeping sound, spread in the population, and then everybody weeps now, right? Through learning. There could be no genetic encoding for that, and it could still be everybody weeps. But that would not be innate because there was no genes encoded for weeping. There are genes encoded for variation in sound type so that they could make all sorts of sounds. And then when individuals make the weeping sound, it benefited them more. So they kept doing it. So that's still learning. And you can still have increase in the frequency of weeping in the population, even without genes for weeping, genes for others. So you don't need to have a learned behavior become fixed and still have it spread in the population.
Ma'am, like it said that in primates, the identification of snakes is an innate trait, but
Yes.
the fear of snake is actually a learned behavior. So how that identification of snake becomes an innate behavior? That was my question to us.
Yeah, I see. So natural selection works with the genes that exist. So if there was a mutation that came up that allowed the sensory system to pay more attention to long, narrow things, that's what it would be. That would be the genes for the neural system and the sensory system to identify this better. We have genes for everything in us. We have genes that encode how we walk. It means it's encoding our muscles. It's encoding the neuronal pathways that allow us to tell our muscles to move. All of this is complexity. We're not really thinking about a single gene, single behavior. It's a complex set that the set of genes that happen by mutation that allowed the sensory system to identify something long and narrow was an advantage to the individuals that have it. Then they use that to be able to tell the difference between snake, not snake, so on and so forth. So some behaviors have one gene, one behavior kind of encoding, right? Like we have a gene for eye color. We have a gene for hair color, gene for, muscle strength, all of those sort of things, the single gene concepts. But actually, for the most part, behaviors are complex, just like a lot of physiology and a lot of morphology, that you have multiple genes that come together. And by natural selection continuing to shape the variation, we end up with what we see today.
Okay, ma'am. My last question is that if there is a behavior which is transmitted to the generation after generation by parental training, and then there is another behavior which usually the individuals learn from observing the others, like in reptiles or amphibians. So what way of mode can be the better, like parental training or just observing the individuals? Because after a point, there will be no parental training when the offsprings will be separated from the parents.
Yeah, neither is, it's impossible for me to say one's better than the other. Most of the natural world does not have individual or social learning. Most animals don't have parental care. So there is no opportunity for them to even learn from parents. Reptiles and fish don't even have to watch each other, right? Because they're not social organisms per se. The female will lay the eggs and swim away. And the eggs will hatch and then they're out in the world by themselves as individuals. So they don't even have social learning. And yet they can do the suite of complex things that they need to do, which is find a place to hide, figure out what is dangerous, what to eat, how to mate. All of those things they can still do. So learning from others, either parent or social, is actually a small part of explaining animal behavior today for most of the natural world. Most of the natural world has evolved genes shaped by natural selection that allow them to learn through their own individual experience or allow them to innately do stuff. So individual learning is a much stronger and more common way that behaviors have evolved than social or parental learning. Just because most of the world doesn't have that. Most of the natural world doesn't have social learning.
Ma'am, and another thing that like in the optimal foraging theory, the individuals which are foraging, do they actually have a knowledge of mathematics? Like it is for our benefit that we have created a formula, but how do animals do the maths? Like I have studied one research paper where they cited that some fishes which do the schooling behavior, they saw that they can count up to 4 or 5. Yeah. But it is more better in the vertebrates, or it's the same overall?
So the sense of numbers and quantity, you're right. Lizards can count up to 4 or 5 also. There's lots of animals that can count, but we're not expecting these animals to actually do the calculation in their head. They're making rules of thumb here. I see a big thing as a predator, and that big thing means more energy. That big thing also takes me longer to eat. So that's really a rough ratio without a specific type calculation versus a small thing that takes me very quick to eat, but is less energy. So it doesn't actually need to calculate the exact numbers. It just needs to understand through evolutionary history that big things have more energy than small things, big things take longer to eat than small things. So if it's walking through the environment and it sees a bunch of big things and a bunch of small things, that's all it needs to rank, right? So it doesn't actually have to do the complex algebra that we did today.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. That's all from my side.
Anyone else? Any other thoughts and questions? Any confusions about what we did?
Yeah, ma'am, I just have one question out of curiosity. Like, I was just trying to, apply whatever you have taught us. So, so it's like, okay. So I generally feed some pigeons. These are the pigeons which regularly visit the balcony, not once we pet or something, which I just keep food and they come to eat. But the thing is, I notice I don't keep every day same food type. One day it's rice, cooked rice or grain or millets, something. But I feel they eat whatever is kept. So there are many that eat. So, as we saw, is it like they are trying to adapt by learning different food types, or are they generally generalist in preference? So is it is there a model or something to explain this, or
so interesting. What your observation is that they are generalists, right? They're eating
yes,
whatever you're
yes.
providing them.
Correct.
It must mean, based on if we use our model to understand optimal diet choice, it must mean that food resources are low or less common, that they are going to be a generalist. Because if it was super common, like Krebs showed and like our calculation showed, then they should be more selective. So it means it's not very common, and so therefore they're more generalist and they're eating what you're providing. It also means that the different food types you're providing probably have similar profitability.
Okay.
So that the amount of time it takes them to handle it and the amount of energy that they're getting from all these different food types are very similar. So what you think are different types of food could be to them actually quite similar.
Okay.
In terms of profitability, right? So we actually, if you could measure the energy over handling time for rice versus chana versus something else, you could do the calculation.
Okay. Okay. Yes, that will be a nice work to do. Yeah. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. All right.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Ma'am, I have a question following up on innate behavior. For example, like sea turtles which lay eggs on the seashore, and then after the hatchlings will innately go to the oceans without any parental guidance or learning behavior.
Yeah.
So, ma'am, though the genes code for proteins and all those things, what is the drive within them which cause them to go to reach the ocean? Or is there any protein?
Yeah, you're right. But the genes, so you're right, genes are encoding proteins, but they're also encoding proteins that do all sorts of things like navigation. How do we move through the environment? We have to be, our brains are wired in a way that allows us to do this. So the genes are shaping the brain or designing the brain in order to allow them to navigate. So they're imprinting on these beaches an understanding based on the magnetic field and of where that location is. And so they can come back to that location because they've imprinted on it when they hatch, because they have a sense of the magnetic field of our planet Earth, which unfortunately we don't, right? So we have no innate sense of where north is or where south is, but they do. And so their brains have evolved the ability to navigate in that way. And so that's how they can come back. They don't have to learn from anyone else, but they've imprinted on that space because they have a sense of the magnetic field.
Yes,
So
ma'am, I get that, like they can navigate innately, but if I want to go to my bedroom for sleeping, I'll get up and led to bedroom, not the kitchen, right, ma'am?
Right.
So yeah, they have navigation, but after hatching itself, they does not even think like where they are going, what they are doing, but simply through the navigation, yes, navigation may be imprinted, but what is the drive to go to ocean? Why don't they navigate any other things or like that? What is the drive within them?
Yeah.
Like
I see. So let's think about when a behavior evolves. Assume that when sea turtles were in their early evolutionary history, some individuals had genes or traits that have them walk towards the ocean. Some had them traits that was like walk randomly. Others had walk away from the ocean. Suppose there are three possibilities and the whole range in between. Natural selection would have shaped this so that the individuals who walked away from the ocean or walked randomly were more likely to die than the ones who walked immediately to the ocean. And so the ones who walked immediately to the ocean have genes that encoded that. If there's variation, if the genes had variation that says, what direction do I go when I hatch? And one was random, one was to ocean, one was away from ocean. The ones that went to the ocean were more likely to survive and passed on copies of their gene to the next generation. And the ones that were random walkers or walk away from the ocean were less likely to survive and did not pass their genes to the next generation. This is how we explain any sort of behavior. What we see today as amazing, right? That the drive that you describe, how do they know to do this? They don't have to know in the cognitive sense that you and I know what we're doing. Just think over evolutionary history, those who did the wrong thing or the less fit thing were less likely to survive and reproduce. Those who just by luck had the genes that allowed them to survive and reproduce, passed it on. And that's how more and more copies of it, and it got better and better and better over time.
Yes, ma'am, I get it. Like I don't have any like that kind of a drive. So I was fascinated to know what driving them to go in that direction, though they don't know anything. They have just hatched.
Correct.
And so it's fascinated. Thank you, ma'am. It was helpful.
Okay. So I think this wraps up our behavior session of inclusive ecology. As you can see from the slide I have here, we've actually covered a lot of ground. Right? We talked about foundations of animal behavior. We spent a lot of time talking about natural selection, and we keep coming back to learning because we can't help it. But I hope by now you see that learning is also shaped by natural selection. Not what you learn, but the ability to learn is also shaped by natural selection. From there, we went to Tinbergen's 4, and we spent time talking about adaptive value. And finally, we worked through an example of cost and benefits. So actually, we did a lot today, and I hope you gained from it. And I hope you see that animal behavior is fascinating and a really interesting direction of science. With that,
One last question, ma'am.
Yes, sure.
Like the moths, fig moths are when they go and lay eggs inside the fig, and then the mothlings will emerge after, like why most of the insects will die soon after they mate. Like what is the purpose of that? Like they are investing so much of energy in everything, and soon after they mate, so many of them will die. Like bees also, the male bees
Correct.
And
But that's all
what
fitness is, right? What when we say fitness, we're really saying how many copies of the genes do you move to the next generation? You can do it two ways. You can live a long time and have lots of mates and pass on genes to the next generation, or you can live a short amount of time and pass on lots of genes to the next generation. Right? So you don't have to live long as you're successfully mating and sending genes to the next generation. That's all you need. So there are lots of different strategies to do that. And the human way is just one way.
Yes.
Ma'am, I have a question regarding this.
Yeah.
Actually, what we see in our college, like the lab rats, when female give birth to the young ones, if she is underfed or she is not having the food, she used to eat the brains of their young ones. So why? Because first of all, the main aim of the individual is to pass on their genes, but when it comes to their survivability, they used to consume their young ones. So why is this? And in many insects like the mantis, it
Yes.
eats the male partner, but if the male partner is alive, they may form another multiple copies. So why this behavior is present in them?
There are lots of interesting phenomena in animal behavior. We can explain them in various ways. We can explain them in terms of like stress, like you described here, why the stress rewires your brain, and hunger rewires your brain, and you need to do cost benefit analyses. So you could think about, eat your own young if there's nothing else to eat, and it allows you to survive to make another set of offspring. That could be the best solution, the optimal solution at that time. So we can break down these sort of seemingly odd behaviors as scientists to think about, current condition, future gain, and model it that way. So I think almost everything can be explained. There's very rare conditions where we say like, this is just too weird. We have to just think about the costs and benefits, getting enough energy now to be able to produce offspring later, even if some of that energy is coming from some of your offspring. And if your offspring are going to die anyway in a bad environment, where if you don't have food, they also don't have food, then you might as well just eat them so that you survive and produce offspring later in the future. These we can quantify and understand and measure.
Okay.
I think we are now at past our time, so we should stop. Thank you so much for your attention and for attending. I'd be happy to receive questions later on, and if there are more questions, you can reach out to the Inclusive Ecology group, and we can get back to you. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am.